Hello, my name is Ricky Rojas, and I stand on the firmest affirmation of the resolution resolved. The construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam will do more harm than good. Getting straight into definitions, they're all pretty self-explanatory. Construction is just talking about both building the dam and its finished product. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is self-explanatory. It's this giant hydroelectric dam that Ethiopia is building across the Nile. It can hold millions of square feet of water behind it, and it will be used to produce electricity. And then more harm than good indicates that this is a fact round. Basically, the affirmation is arguing that the dam will do more total harm than good. So the value of today's round will be preponderance of evidence, since this is a fact round. So let's get straight into our first contention, which is about rising international tensions. So point A is the status quo, and it's that the area is highly volatile. Both governments are obsessed with relative power and have shown a willingness to go to direct conflict. An expert has said that the dam is already mostly constructed in only 5 years, and there's nothing Egypt can do about it except take military action. Many consider the war to have already begun. Egypt has already started multiple cyber attacks on Ethiopia's government sites. Additionally, Egypt has missile capabilities which are able to reach the dam. They've started flexing their muscles and performing more military routines along their border with Sudan, which is already causing escalating aggressive rhetoric between the two sides. Egypt accused Addis Abbas of intent to exercise hydro-hegemony, raising the issue with the Arab League and Donald Trump. A prominent Ethiopian human rights lawyer has said point blank that it will cause a water war. Additionally, negotiations between Egypt and Ethiopia are not going well. They're reportedly very behind in securing that both sides will have the correct amount of water they need in order to continue functioning as a society. And the discussions aren't even at the stage of assessing the impact, but still about how it will be determined of who gets what amount of water, which leads us into subpoint B. And the worst outcome would be war. Both of these countries have extremely strong militaries that are primed for conflict. A war in this area would lead upon millions of deaths, both from conflict, from blocking roads that deliver vital food and water to millions of civilians, as well as the inevitable humanitarian crisis that would ensue. So next, which leads us into our second contention, which is about societal instability. So point A is the status quo. And first, we're going to look at a historical example, mainly Iraq. Iraq is located in what used to be known as the breadbasket of civilization, right between the Tigris and Euphrates River. It sustained civilization in the Fertile Crescent for a millennia. However, Iraqi society has stagnated for decades, even before the wars, because of Turkey and Syria. Neither of these extremely important rivers originate in Iraq. All the water flows through Syria or Turkey first. And this has led to huge issues because both of these countries have built numerous hydroelectric dams across the rivers, which has cut the water flowing down the river by over 2/3. This has led to less water for irrigation, crop loss, and having them to be dependent on other countries. It also because it significantly reduced the flow of the river, it increased water pollution, caused raw sewage to stagnate in the river and increase the river's salinity, which has a very large detrimental impact on the environment. It's basically salting the earth around these rivers. And as the salt builds up over the years, it makes it harder and harder for them to grow the food that their country so desperately needs. Not only that, but the biggest issue is upkeep. Afterwards, Iraq built their own dam to manage water after Turkey kept cutting them off in times of drought. So they would suffer even more because they wouldn't get rain and the river's flow would basically stagnate. But the problem is the upkeep costs of giant hydroelectric dams is super expensive, and it created a crisis. It cost Iraq over $40 million a year. And when ISIS took over, they completely stopped preventative maintenance on the dam, which led to a crisis where the dam was at great risk of collapse, which would have killed over 30 million people in the city of Mosul. So point B is the link, and we can apply this same situation to Egypt and by extension Sudan. The Nile doesn't originate in Egypt. They are downstream from two water-hungry countries, Ethiopia and Sudan. And the Renaissance Dam is huge. As I said before, it can hold so much water that Ethiopia has to heavily throttle the flow of the Nile in order to fill up the reservoir. As Ethiopia throttles water flow to fill the dam, the Nile's flow stagnates. Egypt, like Iraq, relies on almost all of its water from the Nile. Pollution and salinization issues are also really bad for both Sudan and Egypt. Already, they complain that Ethiopia isn't releasing enough water. The Nile has had salinization issues before the dam was even built, but it's getting worse. Both countries release large amounts of raw sewage into the river, and when the flow decreases, it doesn't get washed out, which causes mass outbreaks of diseases and death. It also stops industrial waste from being washed out of the river. Additionally, they suffer from the same upkeep problem. Ethiopia isn't stable. They have huge ethnic conflicts in the last few years, and their stability index is continuing to drop. If there are any problems at all with the dam and they can't keep up with the upkeep, millions can die. Subpoint C is the impact, and it's pretty clear. There's huge issues with water insecurity, how the salinization of the Nile will make it extremely difficult for crops to grow, which could lead to a famine and cause millions of people in Egypt and Sudan to suffer. It also makes waste management much harder as the Nile becomes polluted and millions of people get sick from this disgusting water because the pollution isn't getting washed out the sea after Ethiopia has to decrease the flow. It would put millions into economic distress, but it could also lead to the loss of cultural artifacts as this region of the world destabilizes. So for all these reasons, we urge a vote for the affirmation because it's very, very clear that the Renaissance Dam will cause untold trauma to millions of people. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kira, and I'll be the first speaker for the negative in today's round. I'll first be going over our dissad and then on to the affirmative case in order. Okay. 8 minutes. Is anybody not ready? My time will begin now. We strongly negate the resolution that the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam will do more harm than good. As our opponents mentioned, this is a fact round, and we essentially will agree with all of their topic case stuff. Now, on to the first disadvantage or reason why this simply isn't true, which is that of energy. We see that in the status quo, first, Ethiopia doesn't have sufficient or sustainable energy right now. A is that in rural areas where 80% of the population lives, people have no sustainable energy supply, and 67.1 million citizens do not have access to electricity. B is that they're heavily reliant on biomass as it comprises 92% of their energy share and is 69% and 69% of its biomass energy comes from wood, which has resulted in one of the major causes of deforestation and subsequent land degradation in Ethiopia. C is that hydropower currently only consists of 1.6% of its energy share, which is why we see that we need to expand this industry in the status quo. The second is we see that this is destroying the economy. A is that it destroys investor confidence because 30% of its population is in poverty and investor confidence is at an all-time low. B is that the lack of power means that new businesses and entrepreneurs are limited because nobody wants to invest in a country where you don't have stable access to power, because that both limits your communication and ability to actually trade and engage in business, but also directly limits your manufacturing ability and your ability to produce all the products that are essential in a modern world. C is that of poverty, because as we see that the energy prices are so incredibly high in Ethiopia because of the lack of energy, we see that this is leading to the exacerbation of poverty in the status quo.
Can you stop real quick? Sorry, I think my partner disconnected.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Okay, hold on. I'll let you know when they're back.
Sounds good. No worries.
Okay, they're gonna restart their computer. Sorry, just give them a second.
No worries. This definitely happened to me before.
Yeah.
This.
Hi. Sorry, everything froze like at the beginning of the speech.
No worries. Do
I'm
you
gonna-
want to go back or?
Yeah, I think it's because my mom's judging today and she's also on the Wi-Fi.
Oh dear.
I'm gonna ask her to see if she can go data because she's probably just using her phone.
You're also cutting out just a little for me.
Just give me one moment, sorry.
No, you're good. Don't worry about it. Just want to make sure.
Okay. I think it'll be better.
Do you want? Would it be better if I like turned off my camera? Would that help at all?
Well, yeah, I can't like. Sorry, give me just a moment. I'm calling my mom.
No worries.
Sorry, get off the Wi-Fi.
Just let me know if there's anything I can do.
Okay, hopefully that's better. I still can't load like my case. Okay, it just came up. Okay, I think we're good. Yeah, I think just because my mom was on the Wi-Fi. Okay. So just could you start from the beginning of your case?
Yeah, sure. Okay. I guess I'll just restart then if that's okay with everyone. Okay. 8 minutes, my time will begin now. We strongly negate the resolution that the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam will do more harm than good. Now, as our opponents mentioned, this is a fact round, and they say it should be weighed on preponderance of evidence. However, we believe you should also take into account impacts when you're doing this. Whoever can approve whether it's going to do more harm or more good, which ought to be weighed under impacts, whoever's evidence can prove this would essentially win the round. Now, on to our first disadvantage, well, our only disadvantage, which is going to be that of energy. What we see happening in the status quo is first that Ethiopia just doesn't have sufficient or sustainable energy now. A is that in rural areas where 80% of the population lives, people have no sustainable energy supply, and 67.1 million citizens do not have access to electricity. B is that Ethiopia is also heavily reliant on biomass, as it's 92% of their energy share, and 69% of its biomass energy comes from wood, which has resulted in one of the major causes of deforestation and subsequent land degradation in Ethiopia, because deforestation is pretty bad in terms of soil erosion, in terms of contaminants. C is that hydropower also only consists of 1.6% of the energy share, which is why we see that this is an industry that isn't growing in the status quo absent this plan. Second is we see that the lack of energy is destroying its economy. A is that investor confidence is very, very low. With 30% of its population in poverty, investor confidence is at an all-time low currently in Ethiopia. And B is the lack of power means new businesses and entrepreneurs are limited, because if you don't have electricity, you essentially cannot do anything with your business. You can't communicate with other businesses, you cannot manufacture efficiently, you can't do anything useful, which is why we see that there's no investment now. C is that of poverty, because of there's this lack of electricity. We see that energy prices are pretty high, which is driving more and more people into poverty. Now, specifically, the GERD is critical to re-electrifying Ethiopia for a couple reasons. A is that it's expected to double Ethiopia's electricity generation and bring power to 65 million Ethiopians. B is that there's massive potential because it could generate over 60,000 megawatts of electric power, which is why we see that this would be a huge increase from what exists in the status quo. And even more important is that would be an increase in hydroelectric and electricity, which would essentially be able to outcompete biomass, which is very, very important. Now, electricity is critical to improving the economy because it's really important in things like production and things like transportation and things like communication and global markets, which is necessary in order to ensure that the economy grows. B is that we see that it's also critical to bringing people out of poverty, as they no longer have to pay so much for their electricity, which means that they can now they have more expendable income to reinvest into the economy, which means an increase in domestic investment and also an increase in consumer spending, consumer confidence, which then drives the economy forward. Second is we see that transitioning to hydropower specifically to decreasing biomass usage, which has a couple of implications. A is that of health. Burning biomass releases carbon monoxide and cancer-inducing chemicals, and about 4 million people each year die from things such as air pollution when burning indoors, which is why we see that in an economy that is currently dominated by the burning of biofuels, because that's their necessary and main source of electricity, there's a lot of health problems right now. B is that of deforestation, as forests are clear-cut, as in entirely demolished, in order to get wood to burn as biomass. And clear-cutting results in soil erosion, which leads to sediment runoff and pollutes nearby waterways. Poor soil fertility results in less agricultural productivity, which is really bad for Ethiopia's agricultural economy. For 40% of the GDP, 80% of exports, and an estimated 75% of the country's workforce work in this agricultural sector. However, if we see that we increase this deforestation, which is happening over time, the fertility is going down, and with that, agricultural productivity is going down, which is only plunging more people into economy and terminally destroying their economy. Plunging more people into poverty and terminally destroying their economy. And finally, additionally, the dam will independently reduce sedimentation in the Blue Nile, which poses a huge problem for farmers living in the area, as it clogs irrigation channels and hurts the efficiency of hydropower. So absent this dam, we see that there's going to be a significant more sediment in the area. C is that of pollutions, because the burning of fossil fuels independently releases carbon dioxide, and the elimination of forests means that there's less ability to store carbon in the air, which means on net more carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. The impacts of this is first going to be that of health, because we see that there's going to be a lot of people with respiratory issues, cancer, which directly lead to death and disproportionately hurt low-income people who live in rural areas who have no choice but to use biomass to survive. Second is that of the economy, as we bring people out of poverty because they no longer have to be threatened by the lack of electricity. We improve the economy on net, which brings people out of poverty, which improves the quality of life, improves investor confidence, and the world as a whole, and leads to greater innovations. Third is that of the environment, because when deforestation happens, greenhouse gas emissions also collectively contribute to warming. And this is pretty bad because every action matters. Every 0.5 degree in warming results in around over 150 million people dying, which means that even if we make a small dent in warming, it's going to result in a lot of lives saved. B is that of food security. This is especially important in the context of the Ukraine crisis, as Ukraine supplies wheat, meat to Ethiopian countries in the Horn. So agriculture in Ethiopia impacts food security because they are a necessary trading point in the context of this crisis. Now let's go over the affirmatives case. On to their first contention. The overview here is that tensions, albeit unfortunate, are both non-unique and won't go anywhere, which is proven by the status quo. Now, they tell you that there's a lot of direct action, people are willing to go to conflict right now, and that they've started cyber attacks, but this is non-unique because cyber attacks were already happening before the dam was in place or threatening to be put in place. There's no reason why these are specifically attributed to the dam, and even so, there's clearly no retaliation in the status quo, which is why we see there's simply no war. Now, they tell you it's going to cause a water war, but this is non-unique. Ethiopia has threatened to use its military capability of attacking the dam and destroying the dam, but it hasn't happened despite the pandemic. Also, there are actually 13 turbines already in place, already operating, which indicates that if Egypt was going to do something, they would have already, but they haven't because they don't want to risk war. Furthermore, negotiations are ongoing despite what they tell you because Ethiopia has already agreed to release water. They're pushing for a release of 31 to 37 billion cubic meters per year, which would enable Ethiopia's reservoir to maximum.
How much does that water compare to what the Nile used to send down the river before they built the dam?
Well, I'm just going to continue the word because I think that'll answer your question. But essentially, it would fill it to a maximum of 12 to 18 billion cubic meters per annum, which would be around like half of what they would be releasing. So it wouldn't make that significant of an impact and probably wouldn't fill it entirely to the whole. But furthermore, we see that they're also in negotiations and pushing for this plan to not fill it up in the drought months, which indicates that the drought isn't going to happen, which is why we're seeing that currently negotiations are doing things. They also tell you that there's a significant war and that people really, really want this water. However, if there was going to be war, there are already something like 25 dams built along the Nile. If this water was that critical and was already being stored, this war would be non-unique and already happened. However, it hasn't, which indicates that nobody wants to go to war over water. On their second contention, the overview here is that the warranting is fundamentally uncontextualized, but furthermore, the only way to solve water pollution and salinity is through the GERD. They tell you that Iraq is a great example, but it's not comparable. The river is different and the political situation is very, very different because Iraq was directly in a war. Now they tell you there's going to be a lot of crop loss, but the thing is the water is already super polluted. There's already something like 4.5 million tons of pollution put into the water, which indicates that the water right now is not great. But furthermore, a switch from deforestation to biomass decreases the pollution overall downstream because this directly releases a lot of pollutants when you're burning a bunch of things. But third is the dam provides clean water directly. It doesn't matter if there is water and if the water is polluted, and the GERD would prevent flooding and collect a stable reservoir, which is going to on net ensure greater water and not release a bunch of sewage as they talk about, which indicates that we wouldn't see all of the problems that they're discussing in this advantage. For all those reasons, I strongly urge a negative vote.
Okay, so the order for this speech is going to be from the negation and then onto the affirmation. Okay. All right, so with that, my time will begin now. So just starting off on the framework stuff, they say that we should do preponderance of evidence along with impacts. That's fine. We believe our impacts are way stronger, and that's just basically like how our case is also like, that's just how a debate case is structured. So we will do impacts as well. It's completely normal. Moving on to contention 1 on energy, they say that basically in the status quo, there's no sustainable energy and people rely on biomass. And this is leading to 2 things, which is 1, a lack of confidence, and then like a lack of business opportunities. But both of these reasons are actually like misattributed. The real reason there's a lack of investor confidence and lack of like businesses opening up in Ethiopia is not because of a lack of like available electricity, but it's actually because of an internal conflict. Like when we see foreign investors coming in, they're not coming in into like a rural village. They're coming into a large city. So this is some place that already has like an electricity resources. So the only reason they're not coming in is due to like violence and unstable government and like population, not because of a lack of electricity. Whereas every point they're giving, it applies more to rural areas where investors were not going to come in the first place. So let's talk about these rural areas. They say that we're going to double the electricity, and this is like important to the rural areas, or sorry, this is important to like just Ethiopians. So the thing is, like, Sudan and Egypt far outweigh this. We're talking about one country that already has a leg up in terms of the global stage because they are like more developed than Sudan and Egypt, is going to, or sorry, like already has a leg up is going to outweigh 2 whole countries which have populations in and of themselves who are going to suffer massively from this. Again, every impact they cite in their speech is strictly related to Ethiopia, and they speak nothing of how Sudan and Egypt are going to be affected, which is terribly. So if we just look at the straight like numbers of it, Sudan and Egypt collectively have a way larger population than Ethiopia does. And they're going to be like pretty much decimated from the construction of this dam. All right, then they're saying that food costs in Ethiopia, and the reason Sudan and Egypt are going to be decimated are because of food costs, salinization, environment like pollution, environmental degradation, all the things we talk about in our case, which way outweighs that like Ethiopia just has like better access to a certain like type of electricity. Okay, so then they say, and so also there are like our third response is that there are options other than hydroelectricity that would actually work better. One example of this is solar energy, which which like would be what would be like used in Ethiopia if they were not becoming so reliant on hydropower now because of the construction of this. So once again, we see an example of this dam creating way more harm than it is creating good, because we create a world where we're no longer looking into other electricity options, which would be way better, such as solar power. Solar power is also better for these rural communities. It's better for small communities because it's more accessible, which leads us to our next point. And this is a big one. It's that Ethiopia has no good power grid for most of the country. Again, we talk about certain city communities like that investors are actually looking into. Electricity is not actually the problem with lack of investment, it's the violence. But now we like talking about rural areas. Ethiopia has no power grid to get electricity to these places. So we're not actually going to see all these rural benefits. Like the people who are using biomass are still going to be using biomass. There's no replacement there, simply because Ethiopia doesn't have the infrastructure to do it, and no way of like constructing that infrastructure. So that means that they don't have any solvency for these problems of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide pollution, soil loss due to deforestation. They're going to have to continue to use biomass. Even if you don't buy that, again, we should do some impact weighing here, which is that the impact to Sudan and Ethiopia is way bigger because these people literally cannot feed themselves, whereas carbon monoxide is a health issue that is like decreased by just like it is dispersed into the air. It's like a way lesser health impact than actually not being able to feed yourself, which is going to happen in these 2 downstream countries. So it's just, it's just less acute of an issue. Okay, so moving on to their impact about carbon dioxide pollution. Again, this is dispersed into the air. This like climate change or like pollution effect impact is way has less weight than, again, like 2 whole countries not being able to feed themselves now because their land is no longer fertile. Okay, so yeah, and then we prevent Ethiopia from looking into solar options, which would actually be better because they can be decentralized for rural communities. They can just be linked up into a rural community next to that like specific community, and then the rural community has access to electricity without having to run like kilometers of wire to reach the source of energy, which would be the dam. Okay, so moving on to the affirmation case. So on our first contention, they say it's non-unique because Egypt has threatened before, but it actually is unique because these specific cyber attacks we tell you about was an explicit response to the nearing completion of the dam. This happened last year, and the group that was working with the government specifically cited their anger towards the Ethiopian dam as a reason for why they were making the cyber attack. The cyber attack specifically was an image of included an image of an Egyptian god that was like broadcasted onto a bunch of government websites. It's clearly like an act of like Egypt, national like resistance against this this threat towards their water. Additionally, experts say that like the only reason Egypt would go to war for anything would be a threat to its water. That is how crucial it is in this drought-stricken country. Like water is like their number one concern in all cases. So they are absolutely going to go to war if that like water is being taken away or degraded by this dam, which it will be. Okay, so and then they say like, oh, why haven't we seen war already? We would argue that we already have by the cyber attacks. And secondly, that we of course haven't seen the worst of it because the dam is not complete yet. But we are predicting that there absolutely will be war once there is completion. So this whole argument of like, why haven't we seen war yet is like is not like properly relevant. They say that like the dam would only fill to half about half. This is all kind of conjecture. Ethiopia never stated that it doesn't intend to fully fill the dam, and even at half capacity, it would be hugely damaging to Ethiopia and Sudan because it's just that large. So moving on to, they say like war would have already happened because there are dams along the river already. But the problem is this dam is way larger than any dam that has ever come before it. So it absolutely is a different, like, unique scenario which would cause war. Moving on to their response to our second contention, which was about societal instability. They say Iraq was already at war, so that's why all these things were happening. But that's just simply not relevant because because even if they were already at war, it doesn't change the fact that like the salinity and the making the cropland less fertile is causing like these like inability to do agriculture. Like that is like a noted phenomenon in Iraq, which was the like inability to do agriculture and like the salting of the earth. That is due to the water problems, not because of any war. And then they say that biomass to hydropower, they turn it and try to say that biomass turning to hydropower would equal less pollution. But the problem is we've already proven that biomass is still better by the nature that it can be dispersed into the air and like stored into the atmosphere, whereas like these food scarcity problems are going to be way worse and cause way more deaths. They're way more acute. And again, they stopped looking into solar power. And then they completely dropped our point about salinity, how nevertheless it's going to create these salinity issues with agriculture. And for that reason, I strongly urge a vote for the affirmation.
Okay, I'm going to go overview, neg F. Okay. The affirmative is terminally non-unique at the point where the dam is already built, the Nile is already polluted, yet we haven't seen any of their impacts about like massive war happening. But the only way to solve any of the issues the affirmative talks about is through the dam itself. Let's go on to the first contention. The overview here is that by providing sustainable hydropower, the dam is able to rejuvenate Ethiopia's economy in 3 key ways. Number one is that stable electricity means more business opportunities and confidence. Secondly, switching away from biomass through using hydropower means you improve agricultural productivity because you're relying less on wood, which means you're cutting less wood, which means you're decreasing the soil erosion from like forests being absolutely clear-cutted. And thirdly, we see that healthier population overall means that people are able to work and actually contribute to the economy. Let's go on to the uniqueness first of all. They have conceded the basic uniqueness question here about Ethiopia is heavily reliant on biomass. At the point they conceded this means that they also concede the issues of deforestation that's happening as a result of this reliance on biomass. We see that 69% of Ethiopia's biomass energy directly comes from wood. Secondly, they can see that the investor confidence is low in Ethiopia. They talk about how this is because of crime. However, we will argue that this is because companies simply can't insert themselves in Ethiopia at the point where they don't have access to electricity in the first place. Sure, violence may be a factor, but it's not the key factor. We will argue that electricity is a much bigger reason for why there's a lack of economic progress in Ethiopia in the status quo. Now, what would the dam do? Number one, we tell you that it's key to re-electrifying Ethiopia. This means that you're directly bringing electricity to 65 million Ethiopians. They talk about how Ethiopia doesn't have a power grid. However, they're building one right now. Additionally, you probably need a power source first before you have people who want to pour money into building a power grid, meaning that the construction of the dam should be coming first. Secondly, they talk about how they've conceded that the deforestation that's happening from biomass is causing soil erosion, which is causing sediment runoff that's polluting the river and polluting the Niles. This is ruining agricultural productivity because it's clogging waterways for farmers. And additionally, when soil erodes, that means that there's less fertility and less ability for farmers to farm in the first place. And we will argue that this is directly impacting the economy of Ethiopia because because agriculture consists of 40% of their GDP and 75% of Ethiopians work in agriculture directly. their last response is talking about how Sudan and Egypt outweighs. However, they have, number one, they don't have any warranting about why this is true. But secondly, they conceded our spillover argument about how food security insecurity in Ethiopia would spill over because like Ethiopia trades with Egypt and Sudan. And secondly, we will argue that a food insecurity crisis or famine in Ethiopia would mean that refugees are going to go to Egypt and Sudan, meaning that you impacts in Ethiopia would affect the situations in these two neighboring countries. Secondly, they've also conceded that water pollution like flows across rivers. If sediment is clogging waterways for Ethiopian farmers, it's clogging waterways for farmers in Egypt and for farmers in Sudan. And the point where the partner reads an argument about how there's 4.5 million tons of pollution in the Nile already, probably means that this is a existing issue that is already harming these three countries. Their next argument here is about how solar power will work better. However, guess what solar power needs? Land. And guess what you need to clear land? You need to cut forests, which basically means you're exacerbating all of the issues of clear cutting forests and of deforestation. Onto our impacts. I already did a little bit of impact weighing previously, but you should extend all three of our impacts about environment and the economy and also food insecurity. We will argue that this outweighs on time frame at the point where food security matters in the long run, and it's like a stable agricultural economy would matter for the quality of life of Ethiopians and around the Horn of Africa in the long term. Okay, I think that's it. Go on to the first contention. Extend my partner's overview. How about tensions are already non-unique? They exist and they have existed since the beginning of the dam's construction. But at the point where the dam has already been constructed, at the point where 25 dams are already in existence in the Nile, yet no military response has been taken, probably means that their arguments about how there will be a full-blown war are simply just unfounded. They talk about how the cyber attacks is an indication of war and how this was an explicit response against the dam. However, this happened before the negotiations. And secondly, it doesn't make sense to say that just because there's a cyber attack, that means they're already in the war. It's like saying that Russia and US are in a war right now because Russia cyber attacked the US. Secondly, they have conceded the warranting about how negotiations are happening and they're actually going well. Ethiopia and Egypt. First of all, Ethiopia literally gave Egypt the blueprint of the dam, and they've already promised, agreed to release water in release water in order to for Egypt's population, which probably just means that negotiations are happening right now. They talk about how it's not even half capacity, but we will argue that this is it is already enough to fulfill Egypt's water demand. But even if you don't buy that, Egypt is not going to go to war with. Their only impact here is war, but Egypt is not going to go to war with Ethiopia at the point where any outbreak of war would be really, really bad for Egypt themselves, because they are not only are they economic interdependent, but the fact that not only are they economically interdependent, but the fact that if Egypt goes to war, it would be extremely politically destabilizing. And the fact that Ethiopia is if they claim if you buy that Ethiopia is in a politically vulnerable situation right now, then you should buy that the fact that Egypt is not engaging in war when Ethiopia is vulnerable proves that Egypt is not going to go to war either way. Let's go on to the second affirmative. Again, just extend my partner's overview about how the warranting is just fundamentally uncontextualized. But furthermore, the only way to solve the issues of water pollution is through the dam. They talk about how they're in the unions. They talk about Iraq, and they talk about how this whole crisis happened in Iraq. Then they go on and talk about how there's going to be a bunch of waste and a bunch of pollution going into the river. However, they ignore the fact that pollution and waste is the status quo. The status quo is that there is pollution and that the Nile has 4.5 million tons of pollution in it already. Secondly, we will argue that they've conceded that Iraq's situation is not comparable to the Nile. Then on the arguments about how there will be less water and there will be crop loss, extend the three arguments here. Number one, it is not unique. Number two, we turn this argument because when we switch from biomass, it means that there's going to be less sediment pollution downstream. And thirdly, the dam provides sustainable clean water by creating a stable water reservoir. Then they talk about how there will be like raw sewage going into the water and that industrial waste would just get washed out. However, this is likely not true at the point where Ethiopia is still like heavily dependent on agriculture, so there's no reason for why like their industry would suddenly do this. But secondly, like the raw sewage isn't due to the dam itself, but it's the factories that pollute. Then they talk about the water salinization. However, Egypt already has desalinization plants and they're already building it, meaning that this there's simply no impact coming from this either. But even if you buy any of this, we will argue that their impacts of famine and suffering are better solved through the dam at the point where we've shown that it directly improves agricultural productivity. For all those reasons, I strongly urge a negative ballot.
Okay. The order is going to be some like overviewy weighing stuff, I guess, on the top, and then it'll be the neg and then the app. Okay. 4 minutes, my time starts now. At the end of the day, this round isn't a question of who will be impacted, because yes, to some extent, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt will all be affected, but rather it's a question of how much they will be impacted, and ultimately the largest impacts come from Ethiopia's transition from a small biomass-based economy to a far-reaching electrified hydropower nation. Our impacts fundamentally outweigh on probability, because first, Ethiopia would directly be provided with electricity that not only leads to economic benefits for tens of millions of Ethiopian and brings them out of poverty, but second, we'd see a massive shift from biomass to hydropower that is essentially gone uncontested throughout this round, because it would provide double their electricity supply, it would directly outcompete all of the biomass-based facilities in the status quo and provide a significant amount of electricity, which means that we see a big shift to cleaner forms of energy that result in decreased deforestation, which is important not only for decreasing pollution that directly kills millions of people every single year, but is also important in the context of climate change, in the context of agriculture and the environment as a whole, which means that we improve agricultural productivity and the food that gets to millions of people. We ensure that millions of people don't die because increased chemicals are released into our atmosphere, which means that on net we have direct access to a lot of impacts that make sense. Their scenarios, on the other hand, just don't make much sense, because tensions is disproven by the fact that nothing has escalated in the status quo, nothing has ever escalated in the past, and there's no move to escalate right now, which means that even if there's a couple of cyber attacks, they haven't given you a real impact to any of these. But second is that water is still going to be given, which means that all of their big Iraq scenario just goes away, because Ethiopia has already verbalized and vocalized it's going to give water, and we've already seen in the status quo Egypt is developing its own methods to get more water resources, which means that fundamentally their big scenarios that they say will impact the entire population of Sudan and Egypt just aren't going to impact that many people nearly to the extent that ensuring that Ethiopia has access to better electricity would. Now, even if you don't buy all of that, our impacts are a prerequisite to theirs for two reasons. First is that of pollution. Remember, water erosion and runoff from all pollutes the water because of over-reliance on biomass right now, which means that even if you buy the water gets to Egypt and Sudan, it's already polluted beyond the point of use because it's been eroded by this terrible system of electricity generation in Ethiopia in the status quo, which means that the shift is actually going to get them more usable water, which is better. Then the second reason it's a prerequisite is that of agriculture, because Ethiopia's faltering agriculture spills over, which means that they can't give access to trade for food with other nation, and also contributes to a growing refugee population that ultimately impacts both Egypt and Sudan. Our opponents have two main points. First is that of this idea of tensions, but the thing is tensions just simply aren't going to escalate at the point where not only are negotiations happening right now where they have a plan that's drafted out and both sides have already made concessions and Ethiopia has committed to some form of agreement in the status quo, which indicates that tensions are being alleviated, but second, these tensions don't go anywhere because both countries don't have an incentive to escalate, which is why the status quo isn't escalating and why nothing has escalated in the past despite 25 dams being built along this river already. Now, they also tell you that there's going to be this big water scenario where Egypt and Sudan are no longer going to like have water and it's all going to be wastewater. But fundamentally, we tell you that the water right now polluted because of biomass is a whole lot worse than whatever small amount of pollution you believe that this dam will contribute. But furthermore, the fact that water is already being given to Ethiopia and Sudan means that we don't see a massive decrease in agriculture. In fact, we see an increase in agriculture because the water is cleaner, first of all, and second, we see that Ethiopia contributes to the agricultural stability of the region because there's no more deforestation, which improves water erosion and soil fertility overall, which means that on net, we have a clear path to the ballot at the point where our impacts are tangible, have direct routes from the electrification of Ethiopia, whereas their impacts simply just don't happen, which is why you're going to be voting negative. Thank you.
All right. My time will begin now. So the biggest voter issue in today's debate is that we need to consider all the people in the region. We're not just talking about Ethiopia, we're talking about everyone in this northern region of Africa. And we win off of one main thing, which is outweighing. The populations of Sudan and Egypt together are almost double that of Ethiopia. The construction of this dam may help Ethiopia, but it will definitely hurt Egyptians and Sudanese people. The dams will cripple these two countries. They try to say that like the dam will help because it will actually stop sedimentation, which hurts farming. But the magnitude of them stopping the sedimentation but promoting pollution and salinization is much worse on the side of the pollution and the salinization. The sediment just blocks canals, but salinity stops growth, period. And they try to hand wave it away by saying, oh, they're building desalinization plants, but desalinization is an extremely expensive technology that's typically just used to make drinking water. It's not going to help with this farming. It's not going to stop any of these problems. And they seem to misunderstand what the problem is with the salinization and the pollution. The problem isn't that is the Nile salty, does it have pollution? It's that when we construct this dam and when we start filling this dam, it will drop the flow of the Nile significantly, that the salt and the pollution will get concentrated. It's not just that there's pollution in the river, it's that now it can't get pushed out to sea. So Egypt and Sudan will still be polluting the same amount into the river, but now instead of it getting flushed out the sea and taken care of, it will sit there, seep into the groundwater, infect people, plants, drinking water, agriculture. It will stop people from basically being able to live in these regions. And how do we know that? We can look at Iraq, because this is exactly what happened. Iraq's population has decreased drastically over the last 20 years. And yes, they had war, and yes, they had instability, but the main root cause of this is because they physically can't support their population because their waterways are so polluted. And this leads us into our next thing, which is that they talk about, oh, like Ethiopia agreed with Egypt that they will release this amount of water. But I'm sorry to tell them that this agreement means nothing. Iraq had the same exact agreement with Turkey, and look how they turned out. So if we combine famine, water insecurity, and internal conflicts, it only spells one thing, and that thing is war. We've already seen tensions are drastically increasing in the region with the recent cyber attacks. And they say, oh, if they haven't already happened, then therefore they're never going to happen. But as my partner pointed out, there's two problems with that assertion. One, the water security has not set in yet. The dam is not fully filled. It's not fully operational. We haven't gone through a super long time of drought. And it takes a long time for this pollution and the salinization to slowly seep into the ground, slowly ruin their crops. So just because it hasn't happened yet, there's no reason for us to not expect to happen in the future. So just off of probability, you should vote for the negation or the affirmation, because this is a huge, huge impact that would affect millions of people's lives. But now, so it's very, very clear that this dam undoubtedly hurts the Sudanese and Egyptians, and they outweigh because it's a bigger magnitude. But how much it actually affects Ethiopia is also a little bit questionable. We've already said that the business insecurity isn't going to get solved by this issue because these cities already have reliable power. The business insecurity is caused not by lack of power or by crime, it's political instability in Ethiopia. There's sporadic ethnic and political violence in the country. They're undergoing a huge change in the way their government is structured right now. And of course, businesses don't want to invest. But the bigger thing is that they've completely dropped our argument about how Ethiopia doesn't have the grid power to actually connect these rural communities. They kind of hand wave it away saying, oh, actually, Ethiopia is building these grids. But how is a country in political disarray supposed to build hundreds of miles of electronic equipment in order to connect these rural areas? The answer is they can't. And if they would have invested into other forms of power, such as wind or solar, which can be staged directly in these rural areas, it would have been much better for Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. And so you should vote for the negation because this dam is an atrocity. Thank you.
Good round, you guys. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We have a decision. I don't know if the other judge wants to give some feedback, wants to go first. Please state your case.
Yeah, hey, so great round. I ended up voting for the negative, and the reason that I voted for the negative was, number one, I thought that the negotiation argument on the negation was able to undercut both the affirmative's war scenario, in addition to some of their other arguments about not having an incentive, but also that the negotiation process indicates that there are steps that would intervene before there would ever escalation to a war, and then also the concessions being made during those negotiations would undercut some of the pollution impacts that were outlined by the affirmative. And then in terms of the sort of second contention on the affirmative, I thought that the negation was able to argue against the Iraq comparison. Number one, the Iraq comparison never ended up in a water war, so that kind of further undercut the first impact of the war. But second off, in terms of the comparative context, establishing the internal links to the pollution, it seemed to me that the war context for Iraq was important, especially given that one of the major key internal links on the affirmative to some of those impacts had to do with ISIS and the upkeep of a dam that kind of got lost throughout the debate, but that was there in the beginning as an internal link that kind of gets lost. Additionally, I thought that the affirmative in the final speech had a very strong and very well articulated internal link set for the salinization argument, but I needed to hear those internal links more so in the second affirmative to fully grant those impacts, because I don't think it was not very clearly articulated, the internal links about the sort of salinization and industrial waste concentration in that second affirmative. And because that wasn't fully articulated in the second affirmative, I couldn't quite grant access to all of those impacts because the negation didn't really have a chance to respond to that full story. And so mainly because of that negotiation point, some of the advantages drawn out by the negative in terms of the electricity, and then the severing of many of the internal links to the affirmative impacts, those are some of the reasons why I ended up voting negation for this round.
Awesome. I think we're more or less on the same page in terms of how we came to our ballot. I think the critical question for me to be resolved in this debate is the issue of burning biomass and pollution. It's unclear to me how alternative energy solutions would solve the issue of biomass. And this is, especially given the amount of land required to make solar, for example, viable. And I think there's just not enough reframing out of the MG that takes me away from this critical question. So I ultimately vote there. And then I also vote on the non-uniques and the turns that come out of the LOC that I think also get lost, but are very clearly extended by the MO. I think for me on the military posturing stuff, as well as the cyber warfare stuff, I just given that neither team can read a warrant, this part of the debate becomes really undecipherable for me because I can't make claims, neither team is able to make claims about well, on such and such date, this military leader said XYZ thing, or this political leader said XYZ thing. So it's a little frustrating for me personally with this debate. But otherwise, I think this is a great round, and good job, both teams.
Right. Best of luck to all y'all.
Thank you.